In this video, we will be reviewing our look at 20th century Christianity and hitting some of the highlights to try and bring together some of the things we've been talking about over the past couple of sessions. We started the 20th century with fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, as we noted, is a 20th century American Christian, Protestant Christian phenomenon that provided a term that has been used to refer to other religions beyond just Christianity. And in some ways, it's also been used to refer to non-religious types of mentalities that we can talk about fundamentalist thinking that may not necessarily have anything to do with religion. But is reflective of a general perception of what fundamentalism is all about. And I think it's important to recognize that despite the way in which fundamentalists are deeply connected to the past, there is a vibrancy to fundamentalism that should not be ignored. That those that are fundamentalists, the backward looking doesn't mean that they are inactive. It doesn't mean that they don't have a deep connection to their religion. In fact, in some ways, there might be a deeper connection to the religion than might be present in some other types of Christianity. And really what we've seen over the past couple decades is that more conservative types of religiosity, especially with Christianity in the United States, have been the ones that have grown, while other types of Christianity, what's often referred to as the mainline Christianity, sometimes also liberal Christianity, those have been groups that have been on the decline. And scholars have advanced a variety of theories as to why that's the case. Now, in more recent years, we've begun to see a decline in even conservative forms of Christianity, not as significant of a drop or significant of a transition as we've seen with mainline Christianity, but it's still there, and it seems like in previous decades there was kind of a migration from mainline Christianity to conservative forms, particularly evangelicalism, to some extent some fundamentalism, where what we're seeing now is more of a migration from Christianity to from conservative Christianity to a standard of or a stance of not being part of any religion, identifying as identifying as a seeker, or identifying, when somebody asks, what's your religion, like in a poll or something, responding none. We'll explore that phenomenon a little bit in a later video, so we'll touch on that more in a separate session. But fundamentalism, as we mentioned, is also growing in other places in the world. So, fundamentalism has been exported to the global south. So a lot of the growth that we're seeing in the global south, Africa, South America, parts of Asia, tends to be more fundamentalist minded, or at the very least conservative, more traditionally orthodox. Now, a lot of that is also charismatic Pentecostal, but as far as doctrine, some very fundamentalist types of Christianity that are succeeding in the global south. And again, we'll touch on that in a later lecture. When we're thinking about fundamentalism, some of the key things that were a part of fundamentalism as it developed was the idea of biblical inerrancy. I think this is a very important doctrine. I don't want to privilege doctrine over practice too much. Certainly from my personal background, being a professor, being a Christian, I tend to privilege more intellectual pursuits of religion than the more emotional, practiced type. I believe that's very, very important, both as a scholar of religion and as a Christian. But I tend to privilege the intellectual pursuits, and I tend to focus on the intellectual pursuits. And biblical inerrancy was an effort by fundamentalists to address the challenges that they saw in the earliest 20th century. And really, biblical inerrancy, as we're talking about here, extends back into the 19th century before fundamentalism existed. As we mentioned in the lecture on fundamentalism, biblical inerrancy as a concept, right, that there are no errors in the biblical text, has a long history. Some of the very earliest Christians after the New Testament, talked in ways, they wouldn't necessarily have used the term biblical inerrancy, but they talked in ways that suggested they did not believe there were errors in Scripture. But there is something distinct about the use of biblical inerrancy by conservative evangelicals and then later fundamentalists that is unique to the situations of the 19th century. That while if you could have phrased it to Christians throughout the history of Christianity, there would have been a lot of people that would have said, yes, I believe that Scripture without error. There is a way in which Scripture is without error for these conservative evangelicals, these proto-fundamentalists. That it is a precise document, that it has a scientific quality to it when it comes to how it's presented. And this is one of course, the challenges when we think about, for example, the opening chapters of Genesis and the diverse viewpoints about what do the days of Genesis represent. Well, modernists in the 19th century into the 20th century had no problems adapting the idea of day to be a longer period of time, perhaps even millions of years. And for the biblical inerrantists that were starting out in the late 19th century, there is a scientific quality to the notion of day in Genesis. That it says day, it means a 24-hour day. And so the ways in which people are thinking about biblical inerrancy are different in this late 19th, early 20th century than what had been prior to this point. And there's also a way in which this understanding of biblical inerrancy is not just an understanding of Scripture, it also becomes a way in which you judge whether someone is a faithful Christian or not. So that if someone doesn't hold to this particular view of biblical inerrancy, they are a liberal, they are a modernist, they are not a faithful Christian in the fundamentalist view. Right? And so there's a way that biblical inerrancy is also deployed as a boundary line, right, to determine who's in and who's out. So that's a different way that biblical inerrancy is used than existed prior to this point. But it becomes a very important marker in fundamentalism. Another important understanding of this is dispensational premillennialism. So you have biblical inerrancy, which provides you a boundary line as to who's in, who's out. Dispensational premillennialism, then, is a mindset for seeing the world and understanding why there are people outside. Why is it that there are those outside the boundary of biblical inerrancy who do not believe in the inerrant nature of the biblical text? And so dispensational premillennialism, with its rather pessimistic outlook is a way to see that even in this so-called age of the church, this dispensation of the church, that the church itself is on the decline. And that what will ultimately stop that decline, what will ultimately bring great change, societal development, is the arrival of Jesus Christ. And so this pessimistic outlook of church apostasy, of societal decline, is helpful for fundamentalists in understanding why the world is against them. Okay? And helps in that dualistic mindset of us versus them, right? The church versus the world. Now, as a Christian, as a rather theologically conservative Christian, I certainly see kind of a distinction between church and world. I think, that's laid out pretty clear in Scripture. But there's a militancy that is a part of dispensational premillennialism and even biblical inerrancy that marks fundamentalism from other types of conservative Christianity, and then also a separatism, right? That there's this distinction, the separatism, this need to pull back, that marks fundamentalism from even conservative evangelicalism. That pessimistic mindset of premillennialism is evidenced in what's referred to by scholars as the Great Reversal. If you remember back to the 19th century, right, evangelicalism, a lot of evangelicals believed that not only should they be spreading the good news, evangelizing, right? Those words having common roots. It's not just about the saving of people's souls; it's about the transformation of society as well. And so, if you remember, a lot of evangelicals involved in a variety of organizations, a variety of efforts to transform society, to end a variety of vices, problematic actions, activities, sins, both social and individual, reform institutions, right? But because of the connections that happen between that socially oriented vision and liberal theology in the social gospel, fundamentalists back off of that effort. And so fundamentalists become less socially active, not completely socially inactive, but they're less socially active than liberals are. And there is less of a mindset that the way the church exists in the world is not only to save individuals, but to transform society. And so what really happens is the social gospel, which reflected a lot of liberal Protestantism, focuses so much on social sins and ignores a lot of individual sin. Maybe not ignores, but downplays individual sin. And fundamentalism emphasizes individual sin, individual salvation, and downplays social sins. And I think that, you even see a lot of this today when we talk about something like racism. For more liberal types of Christianity, there is a lot of attention to the structural problems of racism, the institutionalized forms of racism, and the ways in which racism has been embedded in law, has been embedded in social practice, and so there's a lot of focus on what's often referred to as structural racism, and not as much. I mean, they're not a complete ignoring of individual racists, but there's a lot of attention to structural racism and talking about what possible social solutions there might be to overturn that. When you think about more conservative types of Christianity, both those that would be fundamentalists and those that would just be more traditional evangelicalism, there is an emphasis on thinking about racism in terms of racist individuals. And that if individuals would be won to the non-racist understanding of the gospel, right, then racism would decline. And there is either a downplaying, an ignorance, or an outright rejection of the idea that there might be structural things, structural practices in the United States that have perpetuated racism, that have negatively impacted African Americans as a whole, and then also Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, right? And the predominant focus, of course, the ways in which slavery has affected African Americans, but there's also some things that Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans have faced, maybe not to as much of an extent as African Americans because of slavery and because of some other things. So this kind of mindset that only sees individual sin and not social or structural sin is a aftermath of this great reversal. And it certainly is. We talked about Carl Henry and the uneasy conscience of fundamentalism, right? Fundamentalism had lost its social vision, and Henry really tried to get fundamentalists to see some things about social and structural sin, racism being one of those, to try and say fundamentalism needs to have a broader vision than just individual sins. Because when it becomes about individual sins, we tend to focus on issues of individual morality. So when you think about, what are the big sins for fundamentalists in the early 20th century, it's card playing, it's theater, it's cursing, it's alcohol. Not that those things, certainly I don't want to say we shouldn't say there are some individual sins, but there is a lack of focus or a lack of attention to, some of these social evils that are more than just a collection of the individual sins, right? And so we think about, social evil is just the collection of everybody's sin. Sometimes it's more than that. And sometimes sin can infect institutions in ways that are perpetuated just by the institution being perpetuated. So that an individual doesn't have to consciously think or react in a racist way, and because they are a racist, that the same person can both have a non-racist outlook, yet participate in racism simply because of some of the structural things. Going off on a tangent. But I think that reflects this great reversal type of mindset. Of course, fundamentalism does have some successes until the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial providing a great change in fundamentalism, even though fundamentalists technically won the Scopes trial. Right? There was not a great vindication for evolution that comes out of this. Right? That there's not this recognition of, fundamentalists were wrong. That's more the aftermath, right? The way that fundamentalists are portrayed in popular culture, in media, right? The actions that fundamentalists themselves took, all of which leads to, in a sense, a sociological retreat of fundamentalism. There's not a complete absence of fundamentalists trying to impact American culture. We mentioned communism, a very important concern that fundamentalists had, right? And so, active in a variety of efforts against communism. But there is a kind of a downplaying that occurs of changing American culture is not where it's at anymore for fundamentalists post 1925. Right? That it's about more of this retreat, and it is about this fundamentalist subculture that develops. That there is this mindset of a fortress mentality, is the way some scholars have put it. Right? It's the faithful remnant, the elect few, kind of pulling back and creating their own subculture that is meant to protect themselves, and particularly their children, from a hostile world. And as we mentioned when we were talking about fundamentalism, one of the keys to thinking about this is the notion of alternatives. That there needs to be alternatives in a wide variety of areas to protect fundamentalists and their children, right? So there needs to be new schools, right? The educational system is considered to be anti-Christian because they're anti-fundamentalist. So we need to have schools that will help prepare, especially ministers, right? That a majority of the seminaries have sided with the modernists, have sided with the liberal Protestants. And so we need seminaries that will prepare, or really Bible institutes at first. We need Bible institutes, Bible colleges that will help prepare ministers to go into these churches, to lead these churches in faithful ways. And we also need to have ministers who will defend the fundamentalist gospel and be able to defend it against modernism. And I think that we still see this notion of alternatives even today. Right? We think of a Christian college like Faulkner. One of the reasons for Christian colleges is to provide alternatives, right? To provide Christian education, predominantly for Christians, but certainly most colleges will welcome anybody as students. But there is that notion of providing an alternative to a secular institution. We even see it in Christian media, right? Christian media is, movies, books, even television shows, music, all to provide an alternative to secular forms. But often those alternatives are basically the same thing, just dressed up differently. For example, Christian music is in the same styles as, when you think about it, right, there's Christian pop, there's Christian rock, there's Christian metal, there's Christian rap. Right? It's the same styles of music, just with religiously themed language. So, it's just alternatives. And now, sometimes people find a lot of those alternatives lacking, right? And so, for example, Christian movies, a lot of people point to Christian movies being inferior to mainstream movies, and not just in terms of budget, right? You look at something like, Avengers Endgame and how many millions of dollars went into the Avengers movies for special effects, et cetera, right? There are no Christian studios putting that much money into special effects for, a Christian type of movie, which also leads to, larger distribution standards, et cetera, right? So yeah, there's going to be a disparity between Christian movies and secular movies based on budget and funding, but even, there's some concerns about styles of writing, what topics are appropriate, and so all sorts of things lead to people questioning, how valuable are these alternatives? Is this truly some art that we're seeing, or is there something inferior about that? So we still see this kind of, not so much necessarily fundamentalist subculture, but still a Christian, often evangelical subculture. We noted as well, we've already talked about the militancy that was a part of fundamentalism, which leads to some divisions within fundamentalism. As fundamentalists think about the culture around them and how involved they should be, as well as they think about the relationship to other Christian groups, there were some that were very separatist. There shouldn't be any sort of cooperation or working together between fundamentalist groups and non-fundamentalist groups, right? That if a group did not hold to the fundamentalist doctrines, then you needed to stay away from that. But then there's also that separatism of, right, if another group that has fundamentalist theology participates, let's say, with Catholicism, right? You have a Catholic church and a fundamentalist church working together on something. Well, as a fundamentalist, you need to separate even from your fellow fundamentalist believers, right? Because you can't have that connection to even other Christian groups. And so you have a division with the one group kind of staying fundamentalist and the other group developing into neo-evangelicalism, today just evangelicalism. The neo-evangelicalism is a popular term, 40s, 50s, into the 60s somewhat, but eventually the neo gets dropped. Now, neo-evangelicals benefited from, as a lot of religious groups in the United States did, from that post-war revival, with church and synagogue building, Bible studies going on, people interested in religion, religious figures in the public square, on television news programs, giving lectures, public lectures, etc. Right? So there's a lot of attention to religion post-war, and that helps with the rise of neo-evangelicalism, along with the desire to not be as separate. That neo-evangelicals still had a lot of fundamentalist theology that they came from, right? So they're fundamentalist in theology, but they don't hold on to the separatism of fundamentalism. And some people are more militant, some people are less militant, right? So the militancy, spans a spectrum. But there's this desire not to have the separatism. This desire to have an impact like they had before the Scopes trial, or at least to have a greater voice in American culture than the largely separatist mindset of fundamentalism. And one of the key people in all this, not the only one, but one of the key people in this is Billy Graham. There are certainly others And if we had a longer time, we could spend an entire semester just on neo-evangelicalism or evangelicalism as a whole, and we would talk about more of those people. But Billy Graham is one of those who has a very significant influence on the shape and the development of neo-evangelicalism, although he is certainly not alone. But he also becomes the prominent face of evangelicalism. So much so that, as Billy Graham was getting older, as he was starting to back away with how active he was in his crusades, he's not doing as many crusades, he's not traveling as much as he did, in the years before his death. People, news media, Christian media, wondering who's the next Billy Graham. And so far, nobody really has taken that kind of position, although, a lot of people have been advanced by various publications as, this guy's the next Billy Graham, or this minister's the next Billy Graham, or, and none of them really have the same impact that Graham did, not only from, the size of the audiences coming to see him, but also the access Graham had to the powerful, right? The access that Graham had to presidents. Now, we got to be careful not to overestimate that importance, the impact that he made. But the fact that he did meet with every president from Eisenhower up through President Obama, suggests that Graham had some access that other evangelicals didn't. Graham met with world leaders as he did international crusades. Right? And so he had some access that other people did not and have not. Right? There isn't the same type of individual who has the same kind of access that Graham had. So the size of his crusades, the access, name recognition, right? You'll see news articles today about such and such as a famous evangelical minister, and a lot of people will go, "Who?" Right? Because there aren't the same type of people with the same name recognition. There are a few, right? There's the Joel Osteens, Rick Warren, Max Lucado, a few other people like that. But there's a lot of other ministers who might have sizable churches, might be important on a local or regional level, but don't have the same level of name recognition, access, etc. We also talked about the impact that evangelicals have in politics. And one of the questions that kind of came out of the most recent two presidential elections, in both cases, about 75 to 80%, a little bit more in 2020, not as much, a little bit more in 2016, a little less in 2020, but 75 to 80% of white evangelicals supported Donald Trump for president both times. One time, there was great success with that, right? We won in 2016. Not the same kind of success in 2020. So, there's always this question. It goes back and forth of, is evangelicalism on decline? Is, evangelicalism's political influence declining? We've seen this kind of up and down since 1976, right? Sometimes evangelicals have turned out in great numbers and, were overwhelmingly supporting one candidate, and that candidate won. And then there have been other times where evangelicals maybe have not turned out as much, although they are still overwhelmingly in support of one particular candidate, But because there aren't as many that have voted, then they don't end up winning that particular, the evangelical candidate doesn't end up winning the election. I think it's too soon to try and start making some prophecies about the impact evangelicalism is going to make, although it does seem, right, that younger individuals that could be classified as evangelical, right, are not as consistently supportive of Republican candidates as older evangelicals are, right? That's also important to note that not all older evangelicals support Republican candidates either. Right? There are evangelical Democrats, but that segment of evangelicalism that tends to be more supportive of Democratic candidates has never been as successful to this point as the more conservative, Republican-minded evangelicals. And so it'll remain to be seen, first of all, with the decline in evangelicalism that's taking place, whether evangelicals will be as influential politically as they have been in the recent past. Somewhat connected to evangelicalism and fundamentalism, we spent some time talking about Pentecostalism and how it develops out of the holiness movement. Remember the holiness movement coming out of Methodism, but focused on that blessing of holiness, Christian perfection. That notion of that second blessing. There's being regeneration with the conversion process, and then sanctification. Later on, the Spirit helping you become sinless. And so there's that aspect of this, that thread that's here. There's also the restorationist mindset, and we talked about how restorationism is a very prominent idea in a variety of religious groups in the United States as they develop. And even back to the Protestant Reformation, there are a lot of groups that start off as restorationist groups in the sense of what they think they are doing is restoring New Testament Christianity. Now, in many of those groups, as you get to the third, fourth, fifth, etc. generation, there isn't that same concern of restorationism, right? So while, for example, the Baptists start out as a restorationist type group, I would say today probably most Baptists, don't think of themselves as attempting to restore or hold on to a restoration of the New Testament church. That doesn't seem to be a goal that's important for most Baptists. And something similar with Pentecostals, there's still some remnants of a restorationist type of mindset among Pentecostals and certain groups of Pentecostals. But it seems like that is not as important as it had been in previous generations. But important for Pentecostals, of course, is glossolalia, speaking in tongues. As we mentioned, glossolalia had been a part of other denominations prior to Pentecostalism, but never a central focus, never a marker of identity as it has been for Pentecostalism. To the point where for a lot of Pentecostals, this is a sign of, if not conversion, at least your faithful service to God, right? That you've been baptized in the Spirit, and that's evidenced in your ability to speak in tongues. So it's a very key marker for Pentecostals. And although in the early years of Pentecostalism, the belief was that glossolalia would would be other languages, right? Chinese, Spanish, etc., which had more of a mission focus. In more recent years, glossolalia has been more about supposedly angelic languages. People talk about having a prayer language, that it sounds unintelligible, right? That it does not sound like speech to anyone hearing. And so it's that type of glossolalia that seems to be much more prominent in Pentecostal groups today, rather than the early years of it being more about human languages. The biggest moment in early Pentecostalism, of course, is the Azusa Street revivals, the Azusa Street mission revivals. And so Azusa Street kind of is the kicking off point of widespread Pentecostalism, and so we talked about how that development leads to a rather fantastic spread of Pentecostalism. So much so that we even see it to some extent extending into other types of Christianity. And usually those expressions tend to be referred to as charismatic Christianity. So in the 60s and 70s, you see speaking in tongues developing in the Episcopal Church, in Catholicism, in other groups, and even in Churches of Christ. You have kind of this charismatic approach where people start claiming the ability to speak in tongues. Most cases, these individuals, these churches, are not interested in leaving their denominations and joining Pentecostal denominations. And often they have a different focus than Pentecostals, right? So there's enough that keeps them distinct. But there's also a reflection here of the influence that Pentecostalism has had in recent decades in American Christianity. One specific type we focused on as well is the rise of the prosperity gospel. Not all Pentecostals believe in and support the prosperity gospel. And probably not all people adherents of the prosperity gospel would count as Pentecostal or charismatic, but a large majority would. So there's a lot of charismatic influence in the prosperity gospel, and the prosperity gospel coming out of the roots of Pentecostalism. But again, sometimes distinct, because for a lot of adherents of the prosperity gospel, they are coming to it through these individual, often non-denominational churches. And so the prosperity gospel is not denominational in the sense of like the Church of God in Christ or the Assemblies of God, which are two big Pentecostal denominations. For the prosperity gospel, it's more of a loose network of interconnected ministers and churches. So they're all kind of connected to each other, but not in any sort of denominational, hierarchical type of way. But the prosperity gospel has been very influential in recent years. A lot of people paying attention to it. And sometimes, it is these very upfront individuals preaching prosperity, the name it and claim it, the health and wealth type of gospel. And then there are others that are still a part of the prosperity gospel in a sense, but are less hard and fast about it. So on one hand, somebody that is more overtly prosperity gospel would be somebody like Joel Osteen, who is the minister of Lakewood Church in Houston, which is usually listed as the largest church in the United States. Average attendance usually around 40,000. Of course, this is pre-pandemic. So you have Lakewood Church, which is probably more, overtly prosperity gospel. But then on the other hand, you have somebody like T.D. Jakes, the Potter's House, which is also a mega church. And he's not, he's got some prosperity aspects to him, but it is certainly not as overt or as central as maybe you would see with like Joel Osteen or even some of these even harder prosperity preachers. So, there is kind of a continuum here. And if you're really interested in this, I know I haven't recommended a lot of books, but if you want to learn more about the prosperity gospel, Kate Bowler, she's a professor, that's Bowler. She's a professor from Duke University, wrote a book, it's several years old now, but it's called Blessed. And it's kind of a history of the prosperity gospel. Very fascinating look at where this mindset came from, how it's expressed. She visited a ton of these prosperity churches and just a very excellent work. And so I highly recommend that. And I leaned heavily on that because, this isn't something that I've done work in. And so, having a work like that has been very helpful in thinking through, the prosperity gospel and its connections with Pentecostalism. But we see all of these types of expressions, as I mentioned previously, occurring in the global South. That the type of Christianity, where Christianity is growing the most, and we'll reiterate this in the next session, where it is growing the most is in the global South. South America, Africa, parts of Asia. The type of Christianity that is growing the most is it's fundamentalist in doctrine, very traditionally orthodox, but also very Pentecostally shaped. That it's belief in supernatural gifts, healing, speaking in tongues. A lot of it shaped by the prosperity gospel, not all of it, but there's a lot of shaping of the prosperity gospel there. And so in some sense, if we were going to talk about winners and losers in the numbers game, Pentecostalism is the one that is winning right now. Not always connected with Pentecostal denominations. Right? It's not necessarily like the Church of God in Christ exploding or Assemblies of God exploding, although those are growing. But Pentecostal forms of Christianity are the ones that are the most successful right now, the ones that are growing the most, not only in the United States, but in the global South as well. Catholicism growing as well in the global South, but certainly not as much as Pentecostalism. When we talked about 20th century Catholicism, there were a couple things we focused on. The ways in which devotional practices informed a lot of Catholic practice, right? That for the common Catholic in the pew, it was about these practices that drew them closer to the saints, to Mary, that help them order their lives, right? There is within Catholicism a calendar filled with saints' days, with holidays, observances, but then also, practices that help you make sense of your daily life. We used over and over again, you probably got tired of hearing me talk about St. Jude. But he is one that a lot of people can, immediately recognize. And of course, with its connection with a hospital, we easily make the connection between St. Jude, patron saint of lost causes or hopeless causes. And St. Jude has had a very broad devotional group kind of attached to him, right? There are a lot of people that appeal to St. Jude because, when you think about it, that we frequently face situations that look hopeless. And so if you believe in that notion of here's this saint whose responsibility is hopeless causes, you can see why there would be a devotional society, in a sense, attached to St. Jude. But you can also see how within a church that has a hierarchy, and in a very solid hierarchy, right? This isn't a soft hierarchy. There's a very solid hierarchy, a very institutional version of religion in Catholicism. You can see how a lot of people would turn to some practices that would help them make sense of their own situation, not just practices that connect them with the institutional church. Devotionalism also became a place where women connected a lot with the church. Now, certainly, there are and there have been orders of women religious. Many of them we would refer to as nuns, where women have connected to the Catholic Church through being a part of these orders. But if somebody didn't want to kind of devote their lives to the church in that way, devotionalism became a way for them to, still make the religiosity their own, especially in a heavily male-centered institutional system like Catholicism. Okay, so devotionalism, not that men didn't get involved in devotional practices, but devotionalism also became very heavily a woman's sphere, where women were able to make sense of their own experiences, were able to connect with saints, to connect with Mary, and in ways that weren't necessarily a part of the official church, right? It's not doing something because the priest says to do it. It's something where you yourself are kind of taking control of your own religiosity. Another facet that we talked about with Catholicism in the 20th century was Catholic action. The kind of this effort by Catholics to be involved in issues of social justice, taking a variety of forms. We talked about how some of it came from the hierarchy, the popes releasing a variety of documents, talking about social issues and ways to address social issues. It came from priests who were involved in not only preaching about social issues, but actually involved in protests and efforts, for example, being on the lines with striking workers, these labor unions as they developed and as a lot of Catholics joined these labor unions, those priests that were labor-minded would be out on the picket lines with the striking workers, looking for, the employer, for management to recognize their grievances and address them. And so it wasn't just preaching about social issues, but it was being on the front lines in a variety of ways. And then, of course, a variety of famous Catholics that were attempting to, that wouldn't necessarily have been priests, some of them men, some of them women, like Dorothy Day, who were very active in a variety of ways, protests, in writing newspaper articles, involved in other types of efforts. For example, Dorothy Day helping start a variety of hospitality houses to provide food and clothing and shelter for people that needed it. So Catholic action becomes a very broad way in which Catholics are becoming active in American public life in ways that they hadn't necessarily been before. Greater opportunities for that, and certainly with the 20th century and some of the changes that had taken place prior to that. We also briefly talked about the massive doctrinal changes, practical changes that took place with Vatican II. Some of those have been rolled back with later, more conservative popes, but it did have a significant impact, and some of it was driven from the top down, from priests and bishops and from the Pope, and some of it was driven from the bottom up, right? That there were common non-priest, non-nun Catholics who were pushing for reforms, pushing for changes that were then taken up by others and codified in Vatican II. And Vatican II had some very significant, influential changes, some of which are still today, some of which have been overturned by later popes. So, Vatican II has kind of a mixed legacy because of the way other popes have interpreted it. When we looked at African American Christianity, of course, I asked you to watch episode 2 of The Black Church. I would encourage you, if you get the chance, to go back and watch episode 1. I hope that, having that as a kind of a different approach, rather than, a lecture, was helpful. Thought that it was very well done. And as I mentioned elsewhere, I, certainly approached it differently than I might necessarily, but highlighted a lot of the same kind of things that I would have highlighted. But I think that Professor Gates did a great job in a very relatively short time talking about the 20th century experience of African Americans, something that, of course, he lived through a large portion of that, and so drawing from personal experience as well as from the insights of a variety of African American scholars, scholarship that's been done about African American religion, and of course, we've been reading The Color of Christ by Ed Bloom and Paul Harvey, and I don't know if you noticed or not, but Paul Harvey was one of the scholars that they talked to several times. So another connection there with our course. In the 20th century, a couple of very important things I want to highlight. First is the changes that took place with the Great Migration. And there's great migrations, I guess we should say, a couple times. There is this shift of African Americans from the South to the North. Demographically changed the United States, led to some conflicts, as Professor Gates pointed out, as these southern rural African Americans came to the North, where they interacted with more middle class African Americans who had a different approach to religion, and so there's some conflicts there. And so you have this development of there's the denominations, the black church denominations that people will connect with because they were connected down south. But then there are also these storefront churches that develop that are, their way of practicing their religion is more like what was done in the South than what was done by the middle class North. And so there's some conflicts that take place there because of this great change, and because there's such a demand in the North for workers, and inexpensive workers, right? So there's efforts to keep wages low, and of course that it doesn't mean that the North was any less racist, as was pointed out. Often African Americans that migrated faced similar types of experiences as they did in the South, although slightly different in some ways. But the Great Migration significantly changes demographics of the United States, but also the black church experience. Civil rights, of course, is another significant development in the 20th century for African Americans. As Bloom and Harvey point out, right, there's and others have pointed this out, so it's not just them, but I'm trying to connect with something we've read. There have been throughout the post-Civil War period various efforts put forward for civil rights. There are a variety of civil rights acts in the 19th century meant to protect the freedoms that African Americans should have as citizens of the United States. Some have been successful for a little bit, but majority of them, falling apart for a variety of reasons. So, this renewed push in the 1950s, 1960s for widespread protection of African American rights, a push for even greater access to a variety of services, greater access for equality, and Martin Luther King, of course, is the face of all of that, but certainly not the only one that is a part of that. So, we certainly recognize his very significant contributions, but there's some other people that are mentioned in the documentary, others that perhaps most of us are unaware of, who were just as important. But the very significant way that African American Christianity, Black Christianity, tied into that, right? We don't want to just see civil rights as a political endeavor, though there was a lot of political endeavor as well. But a lot of the African Americans involved in pushing for those political changes were doing so from their deep commitment to Christianity, and using that as a means to work out civil rights. So when you listen to the speeches that Dr. King gave, there needs to be a recognition that they aren't really speeches, they're sermons. Whether he's preaching in Dexter Avenue Baptist Church here in Montgomery, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, churches in Memphis, or he's preaching from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., he is preaching, right? That he's doing that from a standpoint of he is a preacher, even though he is, promoting certain political types of things, right? That the consequences of them are political, but they are coming from a deep-seated commitment to Christianity. And even Professor Fia, in his book on Was America Founded as a Christian Nation, notes that part of the reason that King is doing what he's doing is he has a notion of a Christian nation and what that should be, rather than what a lot of white people thought a Christian nation meant. Into the late 70s, the beginning of the 70s, we see the rise of Black theology, and Professor Cone, James Cone, who just passed away recently, kind of in the context of development of a larger theological movement known as liberation theology, we see these theological developments of what are referred to as contextual theologies, of endeavoring to do theology from a situated context. Right, prior to this point, a lot of theology that was done was theoretically contextless theology. Right, the assumption of trying to do it from a universal standpoint. Right, that gender, race, class didn't have an effect. Right? And so a lot of people that did theology prior to this point were just thinking about, well, I'm just reading the Bible thinking, these are all things that are not affected by race, gender, and class. But Professor Cone, as well as some others, really attempted to do theology from a Black context and draw out from a African American standpoint or a Black standpoint what the gospel was all about. And for Cone, the gospel was all about liberation. And so you have to understand the gospel in terms of liberation and how that works its way out in the lives of the church, the lives of individuals, the lives of society. Similar types of things happening in South America, Central America. Gustavo Gutierrez, and doing that, usually referred to as liberation theology, but a similar type of thing, more from an economic standpoint. Feminist theology, womanist theology, also arising around similar times, thinking about gender, but black theology, a very significant point here. And again, Bloom and Harvey pointing out that although Cone kind of starts a movement, there is, in a sense, it's not wholly new. He's building off of what had been done by African Americans before that, right? And so he kind of brings it together, really moves it in certain ways, but he's not entirely, it's not entirely out of the blue. We spent a significant time talking about the relationship between Christianity and the courts, and thinking about really some things related to, what is the relationship between church and state? What should it be in the United States? And we talked about how, as we look at these various court cases, even the Supreme Court doesn't have a clear idea of what the relationship should be between the government and religion. That sometimes it has been in support of some things that look like establishments of religion. At other times, it seems like it has not worked for the protection of religious freedom. So there's a mixed heritage here, or mixed history when it comes to Christianity and the court system, where on one hand there are plenty of times where secularists have said, good, the court made the right decision, for example, to remove prayer from public schools, to remove Bible reading from public schools. And there have been other times where Christians have made the comments, have felt, the court made the right decision in, limiting what the government can do to restrict religious services, maybe in some of the pandemic cases, for example. Right? So, there are times the secularists are happy, other times they're upset. There are times Christians are happy, other times they're upset, and so it's just kind of this, and a lot of it depends on who the judges are, what the particular case is, but Americans have never really had a cohesive understanding across the board as to what the separation of church and state means. We also, I think, see a rather interesting history of not only freedom of religion, right, religious freedoms, but also the developing model of freedom from religion. Right? That as an American citizen, I shouldn't be forced to experience something religious. So, for example, like decisions about not having prayers at public school graduations, for example, even if it's student-led, right? That there's a freedom from religion that people have a right to, just as much as they have a freedom of religious expression. And of course, we would say, well, something like a prayer at a graduation, right? Whose right triumphs there, the freedom of religious expression or the freedom from religion? Well, courts have largely decided the freedom from religion in something like that. So it's really kind of an interesting dynamic that we see, because again, there's this complicated notion of our government and how we try to balance these things, and as justices bring their own understandings of these things to them, you'll see the court weighing one way, and then a couple decades later, when there's been a great transition in the court ruling some way else. We went through a lot of specific court cases that I think represent the broad swath of jurisprudence when it comes to Christianity, because ultimately there is a question in the United States, and that is, what is the role of religion in public American life? Should there be a role? If so, what is that role? Christians have one view. Well, no, Christians don't have one view. Christians have multiple views. There are some Christians that view it as, religion should have a role in public life. In other times, there are some Christians that are more secularly minded and say, religion needs to kind of stay out of public life. So there isn't a specific Christian view, despite some claims that Christians would make. But there is a significant, and the same thing goes when we think about other religious groups and even atheists. They all have different views about the role of religion in public life. And while even atheists we would probably say, a majority of atheists would say religion shouldn't have a role in public life, I wouldn't be surprised if there were some atheists that would allow for religion to have, religious people using religious reasons to have a role in public life, as long as it's limited in certain situations, right? So there probably aren't any monolithic groups where everybody in a specific group agrees this is the role of religion in public life. But the Christianity and the courts, by examining that, it shows us, that there is quite a bit of distinction in trying to figure that out, right? That there's not been a consistent view on that. We talked about non-Christian religions in the United States. Just kind of highlight some things. Of course, we talked about the need to recognize that non-Christian religions are present from the very earliest times. Now, certainly, we would say, we should recognize, right? Well, there were non-Christian religions here prior to any sort of Christians. The Native Americans that were present, the indigenous peoples that were present, yes, right? Those are non-Christian religions, and certainly we didn't. We could probably have spent more time talking about Native Americans, and if this course were just on American religion or religion in the United States, we would have spent more time talking about Native Americans. So with the recognition that Native Americans were here prior to any Christians being here, we talked about more of a focus on Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, and recognized that in the colonial period there were non-Christians among the English colonies, right? There were Jews that were present here. We talked about from some of the very earliest periods. There were Muslims here as as soon as slaves, as soon as Africans were enslaved and brought here in significant numbers, there were Muslims among them. And so there were Jews and Muslims in the colonies in the United States prior to, some of the more modern times. In many cases, a lot of the non-Christian religions faced restrictions that, for example, restrictions on voting, restrictions on serving in public office. Certainly, those that were slaves having a wide variety of oppressive restrictions about what they could and couldn't do. For Jews especially, that changed with the revolution, gradually changed in some places. In some places it took a longer period of time. In the 19th century, great changes in the presence of non-Christian religions. There was a decline of examples of Islam, largely as slave masters kind of clamped down on practices of Islam, and so there were efforts to try and get rid of Islam, and it's not until towards the end of the 19th century that you kind of, after slavery, that you kind of see that start back up among African Americans. But what really changed as well for both Muslims and Jews especially was immigration. And so Jews began to immigrate in larger numbers. And as we talked about it, as different groups from different places in Europe immigrated, there were sometimes a variety of clashes that took place between Jews that were already present in the United States that had certain cultural backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, and then those groups that came more from Eastern Europe that had different approaches. And so those that are like first generation immigrants versus those that have been present for a while. So there was conflict. But you have a greater number of immigrants and greater number of Jewish population. Of course, there is over time a vast immigration of Muslims, and we talked about some of the reasons that Muslims came, coming from different regions at different times, coming for different reasons at different times, but in both cases, seeing those populations increase. We talked about how a lot of the Hindu and Buddhist immigration taking place more later 20th century, right? That there's Hindus and Buddhists present in the United States before this. Certainly not as much in the colonial period. Some in the 19th century, but not, not a huge number like with Jewish immigration. But post 1965, you start to see more of that. But then you also see, some changes taking place, as various groups are westernized, various groups attempt to assimilate into that culture. And so immigration post 1965 tends to be more of, certainly there's a large number of immigrants coming from our South, but there's a lot from Eastern countries as well, that bringing their Eastern religion with them. Which means that, and we'll talk about this more in the next session, that as we look towards the 21st century, the percentage of Christianity, the percentage of Christians in the United States in the 21st century is on the decline. There are a couple of reasons for that. Immigration is part of it. Non-Christian religions is part of it. There are other reasons for it as well, but we'll take more time to explore that in our next session. And so for now, that finishes up our thinking about what we've covered over our examination of the 20th century.